Good afternoon, everyone. It is June the 4th, 2023, and welcome to the second installment of my Stocks to Watch video series, where I will be analyzing stocks coming into the current week that are hopefully actionable for trades. We will also review the previous week's stocks to watch to see how they did. If you are interested in my previous video, it currently is the only other video on my channel. The channel is brand new. Hopefully it gets some traction. And what you are seeing on your screen right now is Zach from Rage Against the Machine singing his classic hit Bulls on Parade, because that is what we are beginning to see in the market. As you can see on this first chart, which is the equal weight QQQ, which is known as the QQEW, pulling out the heavily cap weighted portion of that index, and just looking at it on an equal weight basis, we can see that the bulls are taking firm control of this chart as we are taking out the pivot from August and February. At this point, I can only be looking up until this breakout fails. As such, you will not be seeing any short setups on my watch list. So why don't we get right into a quick review of last week's watch list. They are ranked in order of where they finished in the daily range on Friday. So we're going to start with KLAC. KLAC, as you can see, last week was butting up against the all-time highs from 2022. I did expect it to have a quiet week, and it did indeed. So hopefully it's going to provide some kind of tightness here where we can get in. Because I don't see how this one is possibly done yet. Actually, if you drop down to a 65-minute chart, you can see the action around this all-time high. Arguably, it's already begun to move back up. I have a small starter position on this one that I took late Friday as it closed fairly strong. But I am going to wait for this standard pivot to be taken out before I add any. Moving on to Wire from last week. Wire, which was my favorite setup going into last week, actually didn't do much. As you can see, it still remains above this 1.5 year long base. And on the daily chart, it flagged down and shook out, hopefully some weak hands before ramping and taking out the channel, which did test that breakout pivot. And now we've gone sideways for looks like about 3 weeks now, and it does look like it's starting to meander its way back to this low pivot. That is my buy trigger. It is on my list for next week. Hopefully it gives us entry. Moving on to Samsura IoT, I was very high on this one going into last week. I did not, however, notice that they had earnings, so I could not play it. But this low pivot got taken out with some gusto on what I can only consider a power earnings gap. This confirmed that what we were looking at here in this blue region was a straight ABC flat. And at this point, it still looks good, but it has to reset for any sort of entry. So that one did work out, although unfortunately, like I mentioned, there was no way to get in because I don't play stocks going into earnings. Moving on to Carvana, CVNA. This one, as you can see at the end of last week, was down here. I did believe that it was just consolidating in a coil above this past breakout area, and that played out. So pretty quickly on Monday, we ramped above, back tested Tuesday, and continued up. I don't think this is done. I think we're going to be moving up into this standard pivot here. As you can see, as I mentioned last week, this area here shows a perfect 5-wave impulse. I believe that is the first move off the low. We are going to see at least a brother wave, either a C wave or a 3-wave. So I am in this one. I day traded it early last week, and then I ended up with a position that I'm held over the weekend. So hopefully I will even be adding should we take out this pivot right about here, and that would be for a run to $20. Moving on to Teradyne. Teradyne is another semi. As I mentioned last week, it was a semi that I did not find terribly extended, unlike many of the other semiconductors. It began a fresh uptrend last Friday, not this past Friday, but the Friday before. And I expected it to have a consolidation stretch, which it does appear to be having. I think entry can be had as it takes out that pivot, hopefully this week. If not, it decides it wants to consolidate for another week, that's fine as well. In fact, it would be preferable. But I don't see any way, should we take out this pivot at 106.27 or so, that it won't find its way back to the standard pivot at 112. On the weekly chart, you can see that this is really just beginning an uptrend. And there again is the standard pivot. I do see this one going higher, as I see most of the semis going higher. I just find this one is not as extended. Moving on to Bill. Bill, as I mentioned last week, recovered its breakdown pivot. That's a breakdown pivot that goes back to 2022. It recovered it on a power gap on earnings, and then it went sideways for, it looks like, most of May. And I did think it was going to take this out and run to the 200-day. It has done so. I'm not terribly interested in this stock right now. It's going to have to deal with a lot of overhead supply, the declining 200-day moving average, but it was a good trade. If it does reset here, however, I would note that it is dealing with some fairly thin structure here. If it can get into here and then start to close this giant gap from, I would only assume, earnings in February. But again, that's going to have to do some more time setting up for me to get interested again. Moving on to Coupang. Coupang, I was high on mainly going into last week because it was likely that this entire region here was corrective. It wedged out and it broke above, and it's kind of consolidating above that wedge and dealing with the channel off of the August high. And then we did get that pop, that wedge pop, little wedge pop this past week. And now if it resets, I'm very interested because I do believe that this is corrective. This is the trend. We should see a continuation, at least up to the standard pivot here at 21.28. And then it's going to have to deal with the anchored volume weighted average price off of the all-time highs, which is here. But it is on my list for next week. Tesla was also on my list going into this week. I was hoping we would get a reset before it ramped up into this pivot, but it just kept going. And now it's extended and dealing with that pivot. So I actually think this is a terrible spot for new longs, but it has broken up above this channel. I do believe that this is what would be considered the brother wave to the first move off the lows. And I think we should see a move into the 300 area, but I'm going to need to see this thing handle out a bit here, consolidate, because I cannot buy it in this extended state. Plus, we're going to be dealing with the anchored volume weighted average price off the all-time highs very soon. I just don't see a lot of upside here without first a reset. Netflix did what we thought it was going to do. Last week, we were looking at this candle right here on the Friday, and that then played out with a gap up and a consolidation. Its too is extended. It's not really on my list for the coming week, but was a great trade for last week. Google has not done much for 2 weeks now. It is consolidating at an area framed by this congestion from 2022. Not surprising that this is a tough area. It is not, however, backing off much. I would keep this on my watch list for the coming week because it very well may set up. It is, again, a little bit extended, and this is not a big flag that's forming here. So even if it did pop, I'm not sure how much further it would go before it would just rest again. But it is absolutely a possible trade for the coming week. Costco, as I mentioned last week, was in a large year-plus long triangle, which I expected to break up last week, which it did. These are the 4 days from last week. It gapped up and has gone sideways. I actually tried to play this on Friday, but as you can see here, it just kind of squatted, so I got out of it. I think it's going to need a little more time, but consolidating above this upper triangle line to me is very bullish. ultimately, I do think the uptrend will resume. I just think it may need another couple of days. Another stock that I was on my watch list for last week was DoorDash. As you can see on the weekly, it just put in another hammer candle underneath the pivot. So it's on my list, but it's going to have to do a little more than what it's done. On the daily, it did not it again got rejected at that pivot. It may very well decide to come back to the bottom of this range first. But at this point, I actually do have an alert set above the high of the candle on Friday, because I do believe that this thing is setting up for a pop, at least up to this area here, which is framed by the congestion in 2022, and that would be around $86, $87. The last one is Mobileye. Mobileye, I do believe, was in a corrective flat, which was formed a breakdown on an earnings gap way back in April, and then recovered it, back tested it, and kept moving. I do believe that we are still just looking at a consolidation below these highs, and that this is going to turn back up. But I need to see some sort of hammer candle, some sort of action on the smaller time frames, i.e. the 65-minute chart, to find entry. It's obviously not quite ready yet, as Friday's action was probably the most bearish of all the stocks from last week. However, if you look at the volume from Friday, there's really nothing there. So my expectation is that whatever's happening here, it is corrective. So moving on, we're going to move to the coming week's watch list. And again, we're going to rank these in order of where they finished within the Friday range, so sort of the stronger closes. We're going to start immediately with the home builders ETF, which is XHB. My guess is this is as it pushes up here towards the February pivot, and again the pivot from just a couple of weeks ago. I do expect this to pause. I don't think it's just going to rocket up through this. It may need another week, but it's clearly on my focus list. This is not really on my focus list for trading, but I thought it would be good to show. It is the small cap IWM. I'm showing it more for an example of how the breadth has suddenly popped across the market. This range, which it's been in now for looks like 6 to 8 weeks, has popped on some very high volume, and I can only now look at possible consolidation and further up. Keep in mind, on the weekly chart, it is still really just in this giant range going back to June 2022, but having come up above this range, I do see a likelihood, especially if it recovers this 200-day moving or 200-week moving average, we will see a move back to the top of the range. Just more of a clue than a trade. KLAC we dealt with already. It is back on my watch list. Duolingo. So Duolingo, as you can see, is in a very strong power trend on the weekly chart. But on the daily chart, it is actually resetting as well with a very cute little cup and handle above this base here. And this, to me, is near the top of my list for next week. Where she goes, you're looking at thin structure all the way up to the all-time highs at this point. So I would keep this one on your focus list. It's certainly going to be on mine. Wire, I also mentioned in the previous list, and it's still on my watch list for obvious reasons. Moving on to CTAS, CTAS. This is a giant base break going back to the high off of 2021. It has tested it multiple times. It is now broken through on the weekly. This one, if it can set up on the daily is a little extended. I can't just buy it here, but hopefully we get some kind of pullback this week that'll create an entry pivot. But this is very high on my watch list for next week. This is all-time highs. You have no supply to deal with. And we're getting awfully close to that Livermore level, i.e. $500. I do believe we will see that. Moving on to Dexcom. Dexcom is a favorite over on FinTwit for good reason. We are now, I believe, in the 7th or 8th month of this sideways. There is nothing bearish about what we are seeing here. The volume last week on the weekly chart, as you can see, is very high. If you drop down to a daily, it is obvious to me that this thing is going to give the top of the range a shot. Um, I, and it's so close now. I would not play a straight breakout of this because it's a little bit extended. If it started to pull back and do something even inside this range and then pushed up through here, I would be happy to get in there because you know it's going to test the top of the range. Should it just keep going and break the range, we're just going to have to wait for some kind of consolidation before we can go in. Moving on, we've got Array Technologies, ARRY. This is another one that is getting a lot of talk on the old tweeter. And I'm not as big on this one as others. Yes, this is a very clear horizontal base that has been created. However, I do believe that as soon as it breaks up, it's going to run into another slab of resistance here at 27 or so. 27, 28, and that's going to take a little more time. It is on my list, but probably not for entry this week. It's going to have to deal with that first, but after that, it looks awfully good. Moving on to PACB, Pacific Bioscience. It's just another one of these stocks that has formed a base off their 2022 lows. This is another one that has a little bit of supply to deal with. This pop here back in August, it's going to have to get through that pivot. This is the anchored volume weighted average price off the all-time highs. It's got to deal with that. This is a weekly chart. I think it's probably got another week of sideways in it, but if it begins to make a move and there's some volume behind it, I will absolutely look to be getting in. Align Tech, ALGN. This is one that is unlike the other ones I'm looking at. It's not anywhere near an obvious base breakout. I would note that this pivot here actually we broke down below it, but what's happening is this, and you can see it much better on the daily chart, is we are starting to recover this, what folks were calling a double top neckline. It is more likely that this is an ABC corrective flat and that we are beginning the next move up. So this is a correction. It's likely over, but we need to recover this. It actually kind of has recovered it, but now it's going to have to kind of reset with some kind of tightness to create an entry pivot. And I would actually much prefer it above the 50-day moving average before I look at getting in. But this is one high on my list because in theory, this move from here to here, which ran from 172, basically doubled. We should see a brother move to that, and that would take it well up around $600. This is kind of a long-term play. Let's see if it can set up for us this week. Urban Outfitters, this is a low beta, quiet name, but it does have a very constructive pattern. The big break on the weekly chart 2 weeks ago above this base, which was formed off the 2022 high. If you drop down to a daily, since that power gap, it is really just going sideways. You could get entry if you made a move through the 32.52 level. You won't lose a lot of money either way here. It is, after all, a low beta stock, but I did like the setup enough to put it on my watch list. And if the call or if the options chain is liquid enough, it is absolutely something I would be looking at to play. Moving on, Berkshire Hathaway. I really like this chart for a lot of reasons. So we've broken up above a base that was formed off its November high. We've consolidated for several weeks, going down to a daily chart. You can see that we've got an ABC flat here, ABC, and it just held, and now it's power moving off of that. The other reason I really like it, besides that obvious strong chart, is this is basically a financial, and it has been strong in a market where financials have not been. So I suspect that if financials start to get strong, and they absolutely began to catch a bid last week, Berkshire Hathaway is where you want to be. It is one I would be playing with options for sure. The options chain is liquid enough and they are cheap. Moving on to MELI. MELI is just another one of these stocks in an uptrend that has consolidated for now going on 2 months. I Again, there's nothing bearish about what is happening here. Nice hammer candle actually on the Friday. Something I would be waiting for a break of this consolidation, but it's high on my list for next week. Carvana, we already talked about in the previous list, as we did Teradyne. Here's an interesting one. BIDU. So there were a lot of people watching this one as a possible double top. And indeed, I was one of them and actually played this one short. So it broke its double top. It then back tested the double top and then kind of started to fall away again. I got in short here and rode it for a little bit. And then on this day here, I got stopped out. And then it actually started going down. And I thought, oh, geez, well, I'm going to miss it now. And in the end, it just popped on Thursday. And there's no way that this is in character for a double top. We are now actually just basing. What that means, again, another one of these stocks, which has just formed an ABC flat correction and is based and is likely now moving up again. And there's a projected move for here. If you look at this as the first move, this is the correction. I don't know where this is going, but if it tightens up in here and kind of can create a pivot for entry, it's one I'm going to be looking at for next week. Google we talked about, Costco we talked about, CCJ, Cameco, uranium. We don't talk much about the metals these days because most of them suck, but this one does not. It has been in a symmetrical triangle since this high way back in 2022. And on big volume last week, we broke that triangle. So now on the daily chart, that break came on the Thursday. Friday, we pulled back a bit. If it starts to handle out here, I would be looking at this one for sure for a move to at least 37.08, which is, you can see on the weekly chart, it's actually a gap from 2011 that probably will fill. And then, of course, we've got the next pivot up here. Looks like 44.43, but I would be playing this only for the gap fill to 37.08. I do like the looks of this. Let's see what happens this week. KWeb. KWeb is kind of an addendum chart to the BIDU chart since they're both, BIDU is a Chinese internet and this is the Chinese internet ETF. This wave off of the low into this pivot here, this resistance, looks awfully impulsive to me, which would imply that there's going to be another move, either what would be known as a C wave or a 3 wave. This has wedged down and popped on very big volume last week. It's a little early for me to play it. And even on the daily chart, after the pop from last week, you can see it hit the top of the wedge. It's probably going to need at least a week of sideways. If it does create that sideways and then pushes up through that 27.41 pivot, something like this, that is one I will be looking to get in. Yes, it's got all its moving averages declining right above it. That's a spot that you probably will see more of a pause. But it is one that I'm watching for this week. It is a kind of an important chart. It kind of is reflective of an entire country's market. Well worth keeping an eye on. And the last one I'm looking at for next week is GE Healthcare. This was a spinoff from GE. Not much to say here, except for it's an IPO. It was spun off from GE. It made its way into its high. It's fallen back. And now it's trying to handle out here and create another uptrend. This is probably at least 2 or 3 days away from me being interested in it, but it's on my watch list for next week. So that's all for the next week, week beginning June 5th, i.e. tomorrow, Monday. If you like this video, by all means, like it. Thumbs up, please. And subscribe to the channel. We'll see if this channel gets any traction. I'll probably keep doing this regardless for my own amusement at the very least. Plus, it provides an excellent diary for all my trades. So that's it for now. Have a great evening, everybody.